Topic 6. How secure was the USSR's control over Eastern Europe between 1948 to around 1989? This topic is broken up into 5 moments when Soviet control of Eastern Europe faced major opposition, and asks how effectively did the USSR subdue it. Throughout this topic, we will consider the reasons behind these challenges and then describe the events as they unfolded, and finally evaluate the success of the Soviet response. Focus point 1 asks, why was there opposition to Soviet control in Hungary in 1956? The Hungarians were probably the most resentful of all of the populations that the USSR controlled or occupied after 1945. Why was that? As we mentioned in topic 4, Hungary attacked Russia in 1941. Hungary, under the wartime dictator Admiral Horthy, was a fascist state. Horthy borrowed a lot from Hitler's Nazi regime, and he carried actually a lot of his population with him. So when the Soviets swept back in from the east in 1945, they were not so much liberators as conquerors of the Hungarians. The communist political police in Hungary that Stalin's generals installed, the AVH, or the so-called State Protection Authority, had the vital task of uprooting those Hungarian officials who'd served the old regime. So the AVH was a police force with enormous authority, and therefore powers of arrest, investigation, detention, even torture to crush any dissidents. Here were the post-war 1945 elections. You will see that under relatively free conditions initially, the winners were the Smallholders Party and other non-communist parties, many of them representing the landowners, the businessmen, the merchants. And here are the smallholders' supporters, probably the farmers who relied on markets for the sale of their produce. Well, was the AVH, was Stalin going to accept the verdict of the 1945 elections? All along, the communist pro-Stalinist Hungarian Rákosi was put in charge of the AVH, and he then started to pursue what he termed it himself, salami tactics, the gradual slicing away of the opposition. How? Closing newspapers, stopping political meetings, supervising opposition leaders until they had done something against the law and then throw them in jail. These actions all led to the effect that Hungary would be ready for new elections along Rákosi's lines. So all of the parties that we saw contesting the 1945 election were actually kind of merged into what you can now see is called the Hungarian Popular Front. Front meaning kind of brought together. And of course it was extremely misleading, because this front was really not a merger at all, but a union of communists under Stalinists' control. So with the Hungarian communists now in control, albeit calling themselves a popular front, they were of course taking instructions from Moscow. Hungary went full pelt into Stalinist policies. Farms of the smallholders were collectivized. Land was now under the state. The food market was a state monopoly, and so prices could be controlled. Secondly, Hungary was forced into trade agreements with the USSR through the so-called Comecon, which invariably meant the Hungarians exchanging their industrial goods for the raw materials that the USSR could easily produce. 3, Hungarians knew that their government were then stopped from accepting Marshall aid. Stalin would never have allowed the Hungarians to be in debt to the Americans. So Hungarians knew that the free market was now closed down, and they also knew that at the same time there were shortages. The communist economic system didn't seem to really be delivering the post-war recovery. And unsurprisingly, the Hungarians, as a defeated nation, were forced by Stalin to pay reparations. Now, this state of affairs was even criticised by Hungarian communists. Here's a figure you should take notice of, Laszlo Rajik. He got on the wrong side of Rákosi. He apparently did voice some criticisms of his own party, and so he was taken to Moscow, put on show trial, and then executed in 1949. So there was an unhappy relation between Hungary and the USSR by the 1950s. But events from 1953 to 56 seemed to give Hungarians encouragement that they could break free. What happened? Well, firstly, in May 1953, Stalin died. His replacement, Nikita Khrushchev, pursued what some historians call a thaw in the Cold War. With Eisenhower, he ended the Korean War. 2 years later, in 1955, the Soviets and the Allies agreed a withdrawal from Austria. I know it's odd, the books actually don't mention it, but Austria, like Germany, was actually cut into 4 occupation zones. That was agreed at Potsdam. Austria, of course, had been Hitler's homeland. But anyway, by 1955, under the Austria State Treaty, it was agreed that the 4 allies would withdraw and Austria would become a neutral state in the middle of Europe. Well, that was of interest to some Hungarians. In 1955, Khrushchev met with Tito, the Yugoslav leader. Well, so what? Well, Marshal Tito was a very independent-minded communist, and in fact, he had accepted martial aid, which had subsequently led to the Tito-Stalin split. Tito allowed agriculture, for instance, to be organised along free market lines in Yugoslavia. Stalin clearly felt threatened by Marshal Tito, and we know he tried to have him assassinated a number of times. He failed. Titoism, which was a phrase devised by the Soviets, meant, well, it meant taking an independent line. Now look, here's Khrushchev meeting Tito in 1955, a thing Stalin would never have done. And again, the Hungarians took note. Can you see, therefore, that we have 2 examples of Central European countries, Austria and Yugoslavia, with some measure of independence? Now, this is the key turning point. Khrushchev making his so-called secret speech to Communist Party officials in February 1956. Why is this speech so important? Well, in it, he admits that Stalin had committed crimes. The first time anyone had said that in any kind of setting, in any kind of organised setting, I should say, any kind of meeting. And he says another thing. He says that there were alternative paths to socialism, by which he was really signalling to Eastern European states under Soviet control that there would be some tolerance of deviation from Stalinism. So if you take all of that into consideration, to the Hungarians, it looked as if, with Stalin dead, the USSR was coming round to agreeing that the Yugoslav model, that you could be communist but semi-independent, or the Austrian model, that you could be independent if you promised to be neutral, might also apply to Hungary. Well, what happened and how did the USSR react to this opposition? We can go straight to October 1956. To the north, in Poland, there had been some strikes, some demonstrations against food price rises. And Khrushchev was so concerned about this situation in Poland that he actually caved in. He appoints a more popular reformer called Gomulka, and he amends some of the trade conditions that Poland were operating under with the Soviet Union, and he even withdrew his troops from Poland. And historians call it the Polish October. Well, that offered even more encouragement for the Hungarians, and by this stage there had been some democratic pressure on the communist regime in Hungary. For instance, you can see here the Writers' Union, who are meeting and starting to campaign to Rákosi for the lifting of controls on their publications and the ending of police supervision of the press. Leaflets were being passed around demanding multi-party elections. Well, Rákosi felt under so much pressure that he was actually removed and replaced by the slightly more liberal Gero as a kind of sop to the opposition, to try to sort of show that Khrushchev was moving in their direction. But the expectation actually then gathered pace in October. At the beginning of this month of October, in a demonstration of goodwill, the Soviets actually agreed to the return of Rajik's body. Remember, Laszlo Rajik had been executed in Moscow. They agreed to the return of his body for a public funeral in Budapest. This is the funeral taking place outside, and there's some kind of gathering, of course, some kind of crowd, where, quite apart from showing their last respects to the coffin, Hungarians were beginning to treat it as an anti-Soviet protest. And this, therefore, was, in Khrushchev's eyes, a big mistake. Grief turning into an anti-Soviet demonstration. On the 23rd of October, the Red Army knew that it was beginning to lose control of the streets. 200,000 people in the crowds. Here is a famous picture of Stalin's statue being pulled down. And so on to the 24th of October, Khrushchev's got some decisions to make. He sacks Gero and replaces him with the far more popular, maybe populist, Imre Nagy. This was to prove an even bigger miscalculation by the Soviets. Nagy made a number of decisions that absolutely rocked Moscow. He asked Khrushchev to withdraw troops from Budapest as a sign of good faith. Against his better judgment, Khrushchev agrees. So the tanks start to roll out of Budapest in the same way that they had done in Warsaw with some success a few weeks before. What Khrushchev didn't know was what Nagy's next move was going to be. Because the crowds on the streets continue to grow and they start to launch attacks on the hated AVH, the political police, and people who were thought to be working for them, the informers that gave them the information about the opposition. Remember, these hated political policemen had committed terrible acts against ordinary Hungarians. They'd been Stalin's agents, and now, with the sight of the Russians finally withdrawing after 11 years, the crowds were turning on them. Could Khrushchev tolerate the news that Hungarian communists were being slaughtered in cold blood on the streets? Well, he would have known about these images, or certainly the stories around them, these photographs which indicate the scale and nature of the uprising. Here are women and young men taking up arms to demonstrate that they were willing to defend their capital, even if Khrushchev was to change his mind. And note this very important image here. The Hungarian flag has had the communist symbol ripped out of the centre. visual proof that the Hungarian or nationalist uprising was against communism. So this uprising was national in the sense that it united people of all ages, genders, classes. As we were saying at the beginning, Hungary, a non-Slavic, a Catholic, not Orthodox country, it had had a long history of conflict with Russia over at least 100 years and beyond. And so this was a rebellion that in a way was long in the making. So there was something else that bothered and really bothered Khrushchev. He could tolerate the statue of Stalin coming down, maybe. His secret speech toppled Stalin after all. But on the 1st of November, Imre Nagy took one step that even Khrushchev couldn't tolerate. He said that Hungary was leaving the Warsaw Pact, that Hungary was pronouncing itself neutral, like Austria. Could Khrushchev tolerate Hungary as a neutral country? Would it then go on to join NATO? Does it sound familiar? Ukraine, anybody? Khrushchev really could not tolerate that. In fact, the Americans bear some responsibility for this because they had their own radio station operating across the border in Germany, and a radio station called Free Europe. And it was broadcasting, encouraging Hungarian rebels to take up arms against Soviet forces and indeed to join NATO. Well, unfortunately for the Hungarians, the Americans were not prepared to give any military or material support. They were distracted by events elsewhere in Suez, where war had broken out between Egypt and Britain, France and Israel. With the Suez War raging in the Middle East, distracting the Americans, Khrushchev perhaps thought he could get away with what he wanted to do in Budapest. So he ordered the tank commanders to turn around. They re-entered Budapest on the 4th of November. Nagy didn't fully stop his population from fighting back. And so there was quite protracted fighting between Soviet military forces and Hungarian civilians. There were this number of casualties. Nagy, of course, was removed and he was executed in secret. A far more orthodox communist leader here was put in his place. So evaluation is straightforward. The Hungarian uprising was brutally and successfully repressed by Khrushchev, even though he should really have borne some responsibility for bringing it about in the first place. Focus point 2 asks, how similar were events in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968? So we can turn to the Prague Spring of 1968, where, in my view, the challenge is in a way more popular and more widespread, happening in spring and in the summer with lots and lots of people on the streets, but which was ultimately not quite as challenging and certainly not as violent as the Hungarian uprising of 1956. Now, by this point, Khrushchev was out of the picture. He'd been removed because of his mishandling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Leonid Brezhnev was in his place. Let's deal, like we did with the Hungarian uprising, with the external events that helped bring about an expectation of change and helped bring about a kind of popular and mass opposition to Soviet presence. First and foremost, 1968 is seen as the high point of the worldwide civil rights movement. Here's Paris, here's Belfast, most famously here's America and Martin Luther King. Now, the Czechs were aware of all of these movements. They were aware of all of this unrest. They were aware of all of these calls for social justice in various forms. Second, and related, is youth counterculture. Now, the Second World War had been over for now 23 years, and many of the young people who were listening to the Beatles or going to university in Paris or joining the marches in Belfast or in Louisiana, this is the so-called baby boom generation. They didn't remember the war. But what they did want to bring about was social change. They wanted more personal freedom, more obvious equality, and they weren't afraid to challenge the systems that they regarded as their parents doing. They weren't afraid to challenge those systems that were in the way or obstructing the changes that they wanted. Here is, for instance, a march in Germany which is calling for the removal of American nuclear weapons from West German soil. Here's another you'll remember in America. These are veterans campaigning against the Vietnam War. So 1968 can be considered as the high point of these protest movements that were occurring all over the Western world. Now, how did this impact on Czechoslovakia, which you remember was in a way the least obviously Soviet-controlled member of the Eastern Bloc? Unlike Hungary, the Czechs didn't attack the USSR in World War II. Unlike Hungary, the Czechs never had a fascist government. Unlike Hungary, Czechoslovakia was never occupied visibly by Soviet troops. Here's their leader in 1968, Anton Dubček, and you can see him warmly embracing Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Dubček was certainly a communist. He described himself as one, but he also wanted a kind of Czech communism, one that reflected Czech wishes, which meant more democracy, more personal freedoms, and the possibility of more material wealth for civilians. Remember, these photos of young people consuming Western culture, this refers to a society where people have a little bit of money to buy records or clothes or go out. And it was April of 1968, that's to say spring time, the time of new growth, rebirth perhaps. And so it was dubbed at the time a Prague Spring. Many Czechs were resentful of the trade agreements that were forced upon them by the USSR through Comecon. Czechoslovakia had an efficient industrial sector, and so the Soviets forced them to continue to manufacture high-tech equipment, sometimes military equipment, often machinery, in exchange for buying Russian energy, oil, coal, commodities like that. These deals were not done on terms that were favourable to the Czechs. And did the population want an economic system that churned out tanks and weapons rather than records, jeans, food, things that civilians wanted to consume? Probably not. Here's Dubček in April, and he's just published his action reform programme. He announced press freedom, limiting police powers of arrest, decentralising economic decision-making, which would allow local leaders to take decisions that consumers would welcome. So if you look at these changes to the system, it looked as if he was in fact encouraging his own population to protest in a way that they would see was happening in the West on the television news. Interestingly, when Gorbachev many years later was asked who and what were the biggest inspirations for your reforms, Gorbachev said that it had been Dubček's action program in April 1968. Well, many Czech writers and thinkers took this as a signal. For instance, Ludvík Vakulič published a document signed by members of the public, and it was called 2000 Words. It was a manifesto demanding that Dubček introduce a real democracy to Czechoslovakia. Dubček seems to be persuaded. He said he wanted socialism with a human face. What would Brezhnev's reaction be? Well, he proved to be far cannier, much more shrewd than Khrushchev. In July, he organised for all of his allies to send a letter to Dubček demanding that Dubček do something to put controls on the press in the country. Now, Brezhnev was able to do this because since 1955, the Eastern Bloc had a defence alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact. It was signed in Warsaw, and in that pact, all of the allies agreed to help each other out in the event of external attack, yes, but also internal threat. So he was really calling on the Warsaw Pact allies to see Dubček's reforms as an attack on all of them, as an attack on all of the communist systems. Well, Dubček didn't turn up to Brezhnev's meeting in July, and he ignored the letter. In fact, in August, he invited Tito for a visit. We've said what Tito represents. It was a clear test of Brezhnev's resolve. Why? Well, Yugoslavia was the one communist state that did things its own way. And Tito received a really enthusiastic welcome from the Czech public. So, in August 1968, Brezhnev called a meeting in Bratislava. Now, that was a really intrusive thing to do because Bratislava is the capital of the Slovak part of Czechoslovakia. He's literally calling a meeting on Dubček's own soil. And he got the Czechs to sign up to what we call the Bratislava Declaration. And this is what it said. It said, all regimes in the Eastern Bloc are committed to international socialism, which also means the struggle against bourgeois capitalism. So he's giving Dubček no room for manoeuvre. He's saying that if you're calling yourself a socialist, if you're calling yourself a communist, we're using those two words interchangeably throughout this course. If you call yourself those two things, you have to do what other socialists and other communists are asking you to do. We have to move together. This goes back to the ideology we talked about at the beginning of topic 4. Dubček, of course, had to sign up to the Bratislava Declaration. Smart move by Brezhnev. It looked as if Dubček was therefore himself saying that I need help, that we all need to move together, as if he is himself calling for aid against the Democrats in Czechoslovakia. And therefore, when on the 21st of August there was an invasion of Hungarian, Soviet, East German and Bulgarian states, all four signatories of the Bratislava Declaration, when they invaded, Brezhnev was able to declare that it was at the invitation of Anton Dubček. Dubček denied it, but, and this is another difference to what happened in Hungary, Dubček ordered his population not to resist. So these photos are remarkably different to the ones we have seen of the brutality in Budapest in 1956. The crowds are protesting, yes, but passively. Flowers are being put in gun turrets of tanks, unarmed civilians baring their chest, literally kind of daring the commanders to fire, but knowing that they won't. So the casualties are far, far fewer, 70 or so Czechs, and the protesters had no desire to die. it seems the Soviet troops were much more reluctant to kill. The aftermath for Dubček was less tragic too. He was demoted, but crucially, he was not executed. Gustav Husak, a hardliner, was invited to replace him. Czechoslovakia remained in the Warsaw Pact, and Brezhnev had got his way. In fact, the American media then invented the term Brezhnev Doctrine to describe the policy that the Soviet Union apparently had now, that they would militarily intervene in order to uphold communist regimes and to uphold the unity of the Warsaw Pact. So in response to focus question 2, I've constructed this table. It might be worth pausing me to consider whether you agree about the similarities and differences between events in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Focus point 3 asks us, why was the Berlin Wall built in 1961? This is a straightforward, possibly the most straightforward part of the core content. There are 3 reasons to consider that changed the situation and persuaded Khrushchev to give the order to build the wall. Number 1, illegal emigration. East Germans simply crossed into Berlin to escape. The reason was simple. Even though the city had 4 occupation zones, remember Yalta and Potsdam, the life of the city meant that in fact there was a lot of free movement between those zones, obviously particularly on the underground metro system. And so very many East Germans found it relatively straightforward to find a way to get into West Berlin and then fly out to West Germany. 2, this emigration created economic problems. The migrants were invariably skilled workers who were seeking a better life in West Germany or elsewhere. The embarrassing fact for the East German government and their Soviet overseers was that electricians, plumbers, doctors, these core workers knew that escape to the West would probably bring them better and richer lifestyles. Linked to this is this fact: freedom of movement around the city exposed the East Berliners to seeing Western material culture through shop windows. Burger bars, fashion outlets, records, whatever it is, all of this threatened the Soviet system, which just couldn't produce the kind of consumer goods that were showcased in West Berlin. So both of these facts, the brain drain and the marketing of capitalism problem, led to an inescapable third problem. West Berlin was the hole in the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just that East Germans could flee, it was also that spies in West Berlin had opportunities to exchange information, to install listening posts underground, to tap telephone conversations and so on. Well, this was clearly a major security threat to the Stasi, the East German police, or the KGB, the Soviet secret police, and their grip over the Berlin population and East Europe as a whole. Once negotiations had broken down between Kennedy and Khrushchev in June 1961 to finally pull out of Berlin, Khrushchev apparently lost his nerve. He orders for a wall to be built in August 1961. Almost overnight, there's rolls of barbed wire and early signs that breeze blocks are being cemented together to make the permanent division between the Soviet sector and the 3 Western sectors. And here are some images to show that process. This diagram shows key features of the wall as it developed over the next 3 decades. It includes the barrier, watchtowers, the so-called death strip, which meant that you could be shot if you were caught in it, and the use of anti-tank barriers to prevent invasion. Remember that this wall was described by Soviet propagandists as the anti-fascist defense barrier. The only question that could be asked is what impact this permanent brick structure had on Berliners' lives. Well, first, attempted escapees such as Peter Fechter often died in the attempt to get free. 140 people died in the attempt to cross the wall in the next 3 decades. Second, the Berlin Wall did indeed separate the East from the West. The number of defectors, as this table demonstrates, was reduced. Families were divided. These photos tell that tragic tale. In addition, roads and underground tube lines were obstructed. Sometimes whole underground stations were sealed off and became so-called ghost stations. And lastly, what are the relations between the East and the West, between the Soviets and the Americans, and of course between East Germany and West Germany? Well, it undoubtedly made tensions worse. So the evaluation is this, that yes, Soviet control over East Berlin might well have been tightened, but this standoff between Soviet and American tanks at Checkpoint Charlie on the 28th of October 1961 indicates that the construction of the Berlin Wall did not reduce tensions, but rather it hardened them and created a tangible front line between the Americans and the Soviets, so that in the event of hot war breaking out, it would almost certainly have been here that the first shots would be fired. Focus point 4 asks us, what was the significance of solidarity in Poland for the decline of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe? So far, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Berlin and East Germany. And this one takes us to Poland, and a challenge from an unusual quarter, different to the others. The challenge comes from the trades unions, by which we mean the organised working class. In fact, in June 1980, the main cause of unrest amongst workers was a government announcement that the price of bacon and sausages was going up. More expensive breakfast. Of course, the state controlled food prices, and so it was logical for the people to blame the government. What was different in 1980, though, was that a protest against the price of food became a political challenge to the government itself. Why? It will be remembered that in many ways, Poland was the occupied territory that the USSR cared most about. It was their buffer between Russia and NATO forces. It was the most populated of the Eastern European countries. Poland was the theatre in which World War II began. Perhaps most importantly, it was very clear to the Polish people that their government had been appointed by Moscow ever since that election in 1947. And the Russians had always been careful to try to conceal that as much as possible. But by 1980, Polish resentment was reaching boiling point. It was clear that 35 years of communist government had obstructed the development of the Polish economy. Whilst there were clearly economic successes in the West, the Soviet command economy in Poland was failing the consumer. Shortages, the rationing of scarce items, queuing for hours at the supermarket, these were the norm of everyday life. Well, there were two main non-communist organisations that were legal in Poland in 1980. One was the Catholic Church, and the second were the trades unions. Let's look at the first. Poland was and remains a very devout Catholic country. Stalin was smart. He knew that communism wouldn't go down well. In fact, he once rather wittily said that establishing communism in Poland was like fitting a saddle to a cow. It was insightful. The Poles' Christian faith was held more deeply than their attachment to communism, if at all. In fact, when a new pope had to be appointed in the late 1970s, the Catholic hierarchy appointed a Pole. Here he is, John Paul II, kissing the ground on a visit to his homeland in June 1979. The Soviet leadership was unable to prevent this fantastic propaganda opportunity for the Catholic Church. Let the Spirit renew the face of the earth. These are the words of John Paul, and of course they're the sort of revolutionary promise that a communist might make. Threatening though it was, and the Pope's visit was received by millions of Poles, it was clearly inspiring more support, or rather more visible support, than the communist government of Poland was ever able to do. And now the second area of legitimate opposition at this point, solidarity. What about the trades unions that were standing up to Soviet power? Here is a photo of the 21 demands of solidarity written by Lech Walesa in his shipyard, the Lenin shipyard at Gdansk. Walesa was an electrician. He'd been working there for a long time. He'd become a rather sort of heroic figure in terms of leading disputes of the workers against the bosses. But if you look at the points here, they are completely reasonable within any socialist state. It's worth trying to remember the most important ones. Some of these demands are political. For instance, the right to strike. Now that's inevitably got a political flavour to it, the idea of organising hundreds, possibly thousands of workers into a group that's making demands of a communist government would threaten that government's power. The 21 Gdansk demands were actually very embarrassing for the communist government. So once the Warsaw government caved in, these 21 demands became known as the Gdansk Agreement of 1980, signed and sealed by the Polish government and Solidarity. And why were Lech Walesa's demands so threatening to the Soviet Union? Well, he was demanding the right to strike, but also the right to publicise the demands of strikers. So he was essentially asking for workers' democracy. Remember that that was the fundamental of the Russian Revolution. It was the right for strikers to control their workplace, to design their own work conditions, to run their own factories on democratic lines. Solidarity was a trades union movement, which was also the main political opponent of Soviet rule. In fact, the membership of Solidarity reached 9 million, which was far greater than the 1 or so million membership of the Communist Party. And then there was the question of Solidarity's relationship with the Catholic Church, the other great pillar of opposition that we were talking about. This photograph of protesters at prayer in a Solidarity meeting is evidence that Catholicism and trades unionism were in alliance in Poland in 1980. Moreover, other areas of the Soviet-controlled system, for example, the Baltic states that were formerly within the USSR, they were well aware that these concessions had been made. The Gdansk Agreement would have been published all over the communist world. But this cartoon shows Brezhnev desperately trying to stop the other states in the Soviet bloc from looking at what was happening and unfolding in Poland. So this was embarrassing for Brezhnev's regime. You will see that this next cartoon gives an interesting idea. Lech Walesa was just an ordinary working man. All he was asking for were the sorts of rights that Marx said workers should demand. Therefore, if the Polish government was going against solidarity, the Polish government was going against its own Marxist principles. The Soviets appointed a hardliner, General Jaruzelski, to deal with solidarity and the challenge it posed. By appointing a general, Brezhnev was stating a wish, that is, that the Polish government would use force if necessary to put down this challenge. Therefore, the government had acceded to the right of a vast nationwide trades union movement to call for general strikes, but it had also put in place a military man who might, if pressed, use force to control those strikes. Walesa was becoming a national hero. Once he turned up to a football match and he didn't try to draw attention to himself, but once members of the crowd recognised who was there, a general chant grew up in the stands and then around the stadium. Walesa, Walesa. So during 1981, Solidarity started to go on strike more and more, and its demands were made in particular against the rise in prices of food and the decline or relative decline of the value of wages. Remember that communism was supposed to be an economic solution to food shortages. Collectivization was justified in terms of guaranteeing food deliveries at reasonable prices for town dwellers. But now Polish families were unable to afford even basic foodstuffs. So by December 1981, the situation had reached a crisis point, and Solidarity was on the verge of calling a general strike. The Soviets approved for General Jaruzelski and his record of fighting the Nazis in World War II to use force. So in December 1981, he imposed martial law. This means these things. It also placed Walesa under house arrest. So why did Jaruzelski impose martial law in December 1981? Since it wouldn't have been popular, of course, with the vast majority of the Polish population. Well, there are two possible answers. One is that he was a committed pro-Soviet communist who wanted to reimpose order in the most reliable fashion. But there's another interpretation, and this is what Jaruzelski himself said after he retired and after the end of the Cold War, when he claimed that the Soviet military told him that they were beginning maneuvers on the Polish border and he was under threat of an invasion. That's to say, an invasion much like 1956 and much like 1968, and that either he controls Solidarity or he will face that invasion. So in seeing that there was a threat of the implementation of the Brezhnev doctrine, Jaruzelski acted. Did it work? Well, up to a point it did. Jaruzelski ruled Poland for the next 8 years. He could make Solidarity illegal. He arrested Walesa. Walesa was not able to campaign for a while. Nevertheless, it created an outcry both in Poland and internationally. Because of the publicity surrounding Solidarity, many of the Soviet allies condemned Jaruzelski's treatment of Walesa. The Chinese were among that. The Chinese, in fact, had criticized the Brezhnev Doctrine when it was first imposed on the Czechs in 1968. In fact, Lech Walesa won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983. His wife had to collect it for him. He was not allowed to travel, but he was freed from house arrest and he was allowed to return to his work in the shipyard of Gdansk. Walesa had become an international hero and the Soviets had lost the propaganda battle. In fact, the Soviets had lost the propaganda battle with Western European socialists, and that was something that really hurt them. As we will see in the last focus point, this fourth attempt to clamp down on the peoples of Eastern Europe backfired in the long run, because solidarity were to become a major reckoning force for Gorbachev in the late 1980s. How far was Mikhail Gorbachev personally responsible for the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe? This is the final focus point of this topic and identifies Gorbachev and Gorbachev alone as the reason for the end of this system we've been describing and as the author of the end of the Cold War. Well, can that really be true? Can Gorbachev really have single-handedly abolished the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe? Or did he just accelerate a process which was already and inevitably in motion, i.e., he wasn't so much the author of the collapse of Soviet power, but the agent of the collapse of Soviet power? Let's look at the developments of the late 1980s and take a view for ourselves. All the time, we need to consider Gorbachev's choices and see if he was really doing something new off his own bat, on his own initiative, or if he was just simply and realistically adapting Soviet policy to changed circumstances, to worsening circumstances from a Soviet point of view. Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary in 1985 after a succession of older Soviet leaders had died in office. So what was the situation Gorbachev inherited? First, the USSR was entering the 6th year of a horrible war in neighbouring Afghanistan. They'd lost 15,000 lives already. Now, the IGCSE topic is about Soviet control of Eastern Europe, not Asia, but we can say this. When Gorbachev ordered a phased withdrawal from Afghanistan, he was accepting a situation. He was basically accepting that the war was unwinnable and that there were limits to how the Soviets could repress opposition to their control in neighbouring states. It was a kind of signal to Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union did not any longer have an appetite for the costly occupation of foreign countries on their doorstep. At the age of only 53, Gorbachev was the foremost of the next generation of politicians. Importantly, he had not served in the Communist Party under Stalin. Gorbachev's first task was to improve the economic performance of the Soviet Union itself. Just as in Poland, shortages were terrible. Queuing for basic foodstuffs was the norm of everyday life. Very many of the manufactured goods produced under communism did not match the quality of what was available in the West. Gorbachev therefore announced in 1986 a restructuring of the Soviet system, which was to modify the planning that Stalin was so fond of. The word in Russian for restructuring is perestroika. This meant that factories now had the freedom to make what consumers wanted. Managers could modify what they were doing more in line with updated productive processes and more in line with what they sensed would be bought in the shops. It meant Soviet citizens could come together and collectively own businesses, so-called cooperatives. Perestroika meant even this, that in 1987, an announcement shocked the world that there would indeed be a McDonald's in Moscow. That meant that Perestroika would even accept foreign companies operating on Soviet soil. Was Gorbachev starting an admission that free enterprise and free market economics worked better than the economic planning of state officials? If so, Gorbachev invited a public debate about it, and this was his second task. He knew that these measures would be controversial with hardline communists, and so he brought on a public conversation about it. State officials were nervous about this. They didn't want to be criticised. They didn't want their methods challenged by ordinary members of the public. But Gorbachev thought this was the only way he'd get his reforms through. So he called for glasnost, or openness in English. Glasnost means free meetings. It means freer state broadcasting. It actually ultimately means the freedom to criticize officials in the press. You can see from this vivid photo of Gorbachev literally debating with members of the Soviet public without any sign of guards or secret police protecting him, that he was really involving himself in this debate. And this was really threatening for those Soviet officials of the USSR whose livelihoods depended upon their status and depended upon the public believing that they were the powers behind the whole system. If this was happening in the Soviet Union, then clearly Gorbachev was challenging for other communist leaders in Eastern Europe to do the same, to go through the same process of public debate and ongoing reform. Before we turn to the events in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, we must remember Gorbachev's new policy on nuclear weapons. You will know that there was a strong peace movement in Europe. Here are West German demonstrators calling for the end of US nuclear forces on German soil. There was also fear of nuclear war in the USSR, and perhaps surprisingly, there were even public protests in Moscow in the mid-1980s. This nuclear scientist, Sakharov, had been in exile for years because of his opposition to the Soviet arms build-up. Well, remember that glasnost meant freer debate. And so, under Gorbachev, Sakharov was released in 1986, and he could then speak his mind. He said, the nuclear weapons that the Soviets possess is a threat to all humanity. In 1987, Gorbachev met with the American president, Ronald Reagan, and made the most significant arms limitation treaty in the history of the Cold War. Indeed, I think probably the most significant arms limitation treaty in history. This was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces Treaty, and it abolished all medium-range weapons, those that could be fired between 300 to 3,500 miles, very accurately at population centres. By signing it, he was committing himself to the destruction of 1,836 missiles. A year later, in 1988, Gorbachev announced that the Soviet Union was going to cut its conventional forces by 10%. Well, this meant inevitably that Soviet forces, those forces that had been present in Eastern Europe since 1945, since Potsdam, would be reduced in size So not only was Soviet control getting, if you like, less secure, and the leader himself was going in public, literally questioning whether Soviet forces needed to be there, but so too he was entering into an ongoing dialogue with the American presidents. Here is Gorbachev with George Bush discussing the process of a strategic arms reduction treaty of long-range weapons. And in just entering into this kind of relationship, he was, of course, improving relations with the West. And so, if the prospect of war with the West was reduced, if trust with the West was enhanced, did the Soviet Union still need an advanced guard of massive armed force in Eastern Europe? It is obvious, though, that Gorbachev's reduction of Soviet military spending was not just idealistic. It wasn't just acceding to Sakharov's criticism of mass destruction of humanity. It was also realistic finance. He knew he couldn't afford them. He knew the Soviet Union couldn't afford these weapons. The Soviet economy was nothing like as productive as the USA's. Some estimates say the Soviet Union produced a fifth of the American economy, but others might even put it as high as a tenth. It was nothing like as productive as the American industrial system. And so perestroika was simply practical. It meant that the Soviet Union would no longer continue to compete with America in the arms race. Instead, investment in weapons would be redirected towards investment in the consumer economy. That's to say, investment in producing things that ordinary Soviet citizens wanted to buy, a sort of economic democracy. And all of this, therefore, would have an impact on demands for political democracy in Russia and the countries it had occupied. That's to say, if the Soviet leader was literally saying, communism is failing us, we need to reform it, we need more economic democracy, it was also logical that those communists in power should be challenged by people who held different opinions. That's to say that economic democracy should be complemented with political democracy. And so if this was happening in the Soviet Union, it could not be ignored in Eastern Europe either. From 1988, non-communist parties in Eastern Europe were beginning to be formed. And the leaders in those countries were finding it very difficult to suppress them. They were finding it very difficult to justify using police powers to make life difficult for them. Which of the countries would be the first to bow to this pressure to free up their systems, to liberalize their elections, to allow non-communists to stand for power? It was in Poland in April 1989 that General Jaruzelski bowed to the inevitable. He calls for elections, he allows non-communists to stand, and of course he has legalized solidarity. And you can see from the results how significant solidarity had remained, how popular they continued to be, despite the fact that they hadn't been able to campaign properly in the intervening 7 years. Poland's neighbours were next. This is perhaps what Eisenhower would have called a domino effect, perhaps a reverse domino effect. In Hungary, perhaps unsurprisingly, parties were quickly restored. The parties that we remember that were abolished after the war, the Smallholders Party, the Social Democrats, well, they were allowed to reform themselves and contest elections in the summer of 1989. And in the winter, in Czechoslovakia, new elections brought Dubček back. He was elected as the leader of a new parliament. There he is on the right, looking a bit older, of course, and on the left, the poet Václav Havel has just been elected as president of the new non-communist Czechoslovakia. So Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the three countries that we've looked at in the focus points, in all three, Communist Party power was much reduced in 1989. In all three countries, market reforms were announced. All three, of course, closer to the impact of Western Europe than Romania and Bulgaria in the southeast. They would also change a little bit later, where things were not quite so restive at this point, but nevertheless, the leaders there were beginning to feel the cold wind of change. Well, without Gorbachev's lead, it is hard to imagine that these things would have been possible as early as 1989. After all, in 1989, non-communist parties were allowed to contest elections within the USSR, and that was Gorbachev's doing. You will remember that we said that the Cold War was ultimately the superpowers' dispute over what to do in Germany and Eastern Europe. But it was always Germany itself that was the key point of contention. Germany's status, its integrity, the timetable for its withdrawal, the arrangements about its armed forces, its political constitution, and so on. And therefore it makes sense that if the Cold War ultimately began in Germany, the Cold War would ultimately be ended in Germany, or rather it would be in Germany that it would be seen to end. Well, how? This was the very unpopular East German leader, Erich Honecker, and he was under a lot of pressure from his own public, who were well aware what was happening in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. 5 years before, demonstrations on the street would have been stopped by brute police force, but in 1989 that was fast becoming impossible. Well, why? Gorbachev's glasnost had set the example, and the Soviet Union's client regimes in Eastern Europe had always looked to Moscow for a lead, for an example to follow. What was bad for Honecker was that thousands of East Germans were already fleeing to the West. The new non-communist government in Hungary had signed an agreement with the Austrians in June 1989 that pulled down the physical Iron Curtain between the two countries. Well, what happened? Of course, East German families took up the opportunity of travelling across this newly opened border. These light blue arrows on the map indicate how they travelled from East Germany through Czechoslovakia into Hungary, through the gap in the Iron Curtain to Austria, and then up north to West Germany, very often, of course, reuniting with family or friends that they hadn't seen for a very long time. Gorbachev put it like this. He said people were voting with their feet. And so what could Honecker do, since it now looked as if Germany or the German people were kind of unifying themselves? Would the USSR stand in the way? Would Gorbachev prevent the East from merging into the larger, richer, democratic West Germany? It seemed unlikely he would stand in its way if that's what East Germans wanted. Everything would become clear in October of 1989, and this was because Erich Honecker invited Gorbachev to a birthday party. You'll remember this. More exactly, it was the 40th anniversary of the formation of the GDR. You'll remember this slide from topic 4, when the GDR was formed, just after the Berlin blockade had finished. It was formed in October 1949. Would those celebrations go well in October 1989? As crowds gathered for the official celebrations, Honecker had to face a terrible embarrassment. The crowd was chanting Gorbachev's name as if he was like a kind of rock star. In fact, everyone could hear a chant saying, "Gorby, Gorby, save us, save us." It must have been incredibly embarrassing for Honecker. In fact, as Honecker looks on, you can see Gorbachev's checking his watch. Either he's bored or perhaps he's indicating that the time is up. Gorbachev's officials were asked that day, would he intervene? Would he intervene to save the communist regime in Germany? And the reply of his spokesman was, they can do it their way, i.e., no. You'll remember what we called the Brezhnev Doctrine, the policy that was carried out in 1968 to suppress Dubček's Prague Spring, the policy to call on the Warsaw Pact to intervene to help member states repress anti-communist movements. Well, in October 1989, Gorbachev effectively ripped up the Brezhnev Doctrine by telling Honecker that he would not order Soviet troops to repress East German citizens protesting against his misgovernment. Gorbachev said, the situation in the GDR, judging by everything we see, is moving at an increasing speed. Is there a danger of getting left behind the reforms? Remember, we said that to be behind is always to lose. We know that from our own experience. So once it became clear to the population that the Soviet army was not going to act violently, and it became clear that neither would the East German police, on the 9th of November, East Berliners tested the nerve of the leadership by climbing onto the Berlin Wall. Nothing happened. Crossing the Berlin Wall. Nothing happened. And then starting to pull it down. And by the end of 1989, the collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe was even more dramatic. Just a year after the pulling down of the wall, the Soviet Union agreed to a treaty of withdrawal from Eastern Germany, and then, of course, agreed to the political reunification of West and East Germany. And Gorbachev also had to acknowledge the domino effect of desovietization at home, the breaking up of the USSR, which was itself, of course, a union of 15 different nations. Well, which ones would break away first? It was, of course, the most recently acquired ones, the Baltic republics that were conquered in 1945. It was there that demands were made at first to break away from the USSR. And so, in 1990, with huge and visible protests, these marvellous of human chains being formed across the whole length and breadth of Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, these Baltic Soviet republics declared themselves to be independent states, to be independent of Moscow. In 1991, the USSR itself was dissolved. The process of Stalin's attempts to control Eastern Europe, which began, of course, in 1939 with the Soviet Pact, which we dealt with in topic 3, was now in full reverse. So to return to our focus point, how far was Gorbachev personally responsible for the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe? You will hopefully have ideas of your own as to how you can organize this. Here is a table that helps. On the left, actions that were carried out by Gorbachev himself on his own initiative, sometimes, and in fact often, to the huge disapproval of fellow communists. such as this young KGB officer, for example, Vladimir Putin, who himself witnessed events in Germany in 1989 at first hand. On the right, though, I have suggested that there are wider developments, which, if you like, were factors that were well beyond the control of Gorbachev or any individual. You will see that most of the actions of Gorbachev on the left were partly made by the circumstances on the right, except perhaps one, the last one. The decision to embark on perestroika and glasnost really were his responsibility, I think. They really were taken at his own initiative. It's almost impossible to imagine that the post-war occupation, which was the legacy of Soviet victory over the Nazis 45 years before, could have been justified for very much longer. For many of the new generation of Soviets and Eastern Europeans, World War II was something that they learned about in school. It was now far in the distant memory. And this generation wanted to imagine things could be different. So the Cold War, like the World War, became history.